Welcome back, everybody. As promised, I have got the brilliant Emma Pinchbeck with me, who is Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, the CCC. She really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do one anyway, because otherwise I've got nothing to do. So as promised, Emma's going to present on the annual report on the UK's progress in cutting emissions. That report, you may be familiar with it, highlights areas of achievement and identifies where further action is needed and outlines the priorities for the government should focus on in the year ahead. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Emma Pinchbeck.
Thank you. Hello. Oh, that is working. Okay, good. Hi, everyone. It's lunchtime. My expectation levels are low. That's fine. I had sandwiches before I came in, so I'm good. Good news for you, this is brand new analysis. So we launched the progress report this morning. In fact, it was so much brand new analysis that I couldn't send the organisers the slides until the embargo was lifted at 9, which was in no way stressful for them. Just promising them that it would be fine. And it's leading the news. So if you've seen the news today, this is the report that's in the news. I'm going to take you through some of it. For those of you that don't know, the Climate Change Committee, we're not part of government, we're independent from government. We're a statutory body, though, under the Climate Change Act, and we've got 3 jobs under the Climate Change Act, and then some other ad hoc duties. The 3 jobs are primarily advising the UK government about a decade ahead of need on what the next level of the next carbon budget should be. And so we've just done that in March for the years 2038 to 2042. If you don't know what a carbon budget is, instead of having hard decadal targets in the UK or technology targets to reduce our emissions, on the road to that 2050 net zero goal, we've broken down emissions into 5-year chunks in the economy. And the job of the CCC is to look across the economy, look at technology developments, look at what's happening in businesses like the ones that you're all involved in, and recommend a level for the carbon budget. So what should we be aiming for? And that is our big statutory role. And then every year we get to audit the government's progress, which is the fun bit of the job, because it's not our numbers up for debate, it's what has happened in the economy and what is the government doing or not doing, and that's the report today. We have another job that isn't as well known, which is we're also the statutory body for climate change risk in the economy, so we advise the Cabinet Office and DEFRA on behalf of all of government about the level of risk in the UK economy if we don't decarbonise, so what a 3 degrees world would look like for our infrastructure, for our communities and so on. That big report we do every 5 years, and that's coming next spring, just to trail it. And the job is a great privilege. As Chief Exec, I run the Secretariat, which does all of the analysis. We have a committee of world-class scientists, technologists, and others who advise on the research. And what I'm going to show you today is that kind of combination of things. Okay. So some good news. It's rare you can do a good news story, it feels like, in 2025. But the UK's progress on emissions reduction is real. I realise there's cynicism out there, but it is real, it's quantifiable, we can measure it in the economy. And what this chart here shows you is progress in emissions reductions from 1990, and that's the grey line at the top. We've just over halved our emissions since 1990. I'll show you how we've done that in a moment. But the important thing for you to look at in this chart is the grey line coming through. These yellow bars here are the first 3 carbon budgets. So they are what we did in the 2010s and onwards following the introduction of the Climate Change Act. And then the pink ones, or pink, I've been told this colour is pinkish. The pinkish bars are the live carbon budgets. So they are targets in law, levels of emissions reduction that the government have accepted and Parliament has legislated for. And the yellow line is the trajectory through from the government's plans. So that dotted yellow line is what the government have said it's going to do in its own published assessment of delivery. Because we recommend on the level, we publish an illustrative pathway of the things that we think should be done to get there, but of course we are an independent body. We don't have responsibility, amongst other things, for social policy, industrial policy, or other issues which are very relevant to governments. We're the carbon people, so occasionally government will diverge from our pathway in their own policies. And it's the carbon budget delivery plan that is actually the delivery roadmap to the eventual number. And so that's what we show in the progress reports. You'll notice there's a bit of a gap between the one that says CB5 and CB6, so you can probably see a pinkish bar that drops. And that's because from CB6 and then the bright purple one in the end, onwards, that's when we changed the national target up from 80% emissions reduction to the net zero target. So you can see that shift in level of ambition. Importantly, the pathway in the carbon budget delivery plan and in our analysis, and particularly in our analysis for the 7th carbon budget, was designed with net zero in mind. So this is, I suppose, the UK's roadmap towards meeting our climate ambition. And the good news is, as you can see the yellow line kind of coming through, we're roughly on track. And we've upgraded our assessment of government progress and technology rollout from last year. Emissions were about 2.5% down year on year from the year before. And it's 10 years of steady progress on emissions reduction now in the UK, on top of which, since the passing of the Climate Change Act, emissions reduction pace doubled. So if you hear skepticism out there about whether climate governance works, about whether carbon budgets work, about, maybe we should do this differently, the data now shows that it is working and it is driving real success in the market. The last thing I want to say about the carbon budgets and that grey line, when you look at the analysis, which I recommend you do, alongside this report on the 7th carbon budget, all 400 pages of it, you're welcome. Once you've read it, I will tell you that it will be wrong in places. The Climate Change Committee, particularly when we're forecasting, will absolutely be wrong, and will be wrong in the following way. Those of you that are sitting in the audience that are innovating on new technologies will do something that surprises us. And when we passed the carbon budgets in the early 2010s, for example, the Climate Change Committee at the time will not have modelled offshore wind in such a significant way into the pathway, but offshore wind has been the flagship energy technology for decarbonising. What the Climate Change Committee got right is the appropriate level of ambition. So it's a really great role to be in for us, because we have broadly been absolutely right about the feasibility of delivery, the level of ambition, the kind of structure of the UK's economy, but we've left a lot of room for innovation in the private market to surprise us, and that is why you should all become massive fans of the carbon budgets, as well as me. Right. I realise I've got a vested interest. Okay. This is how we've made progress to date, and the important lines to pay attention to here are really the bright yellow line at the top. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the purple line at the bottom. That bright yellow line is electricity supply. And the 50% emissions reduction in the UK to date has been driven primarily by removing coal from our electricity generation and replacing it with renewables. Now, my specialism is energy policy. I spent the last 15 years working in the private energy sector. And I will tell you that at the time in 2008, we thought we would probably go from coal to gas to renewables. And what's happened is, yes, we have got some gas on the system as a balancer for renewables, but we've got many more renewables than we thought were possible at the time, faster than we thought were possible. So the UK is one of the places that's shown you can do coal to renewables without really depending on gas as a kind of transition fuel. And that's behind that kind of plummet. Here, we turned off our last coal-fired power station last year, which is astonishing, and I'll show you that slide in a moment. The other important lines here in terms of what we can see happening in the economy, this purple one at the bottom is planes. It's just worth noting that it looks like a funny line, so we sometimes get asked about it. We have seen emissions from aviation go up 9% year on year, so it's bounced back after the pandemic. That's a bit higher than we thought that it might do, and so that's something that we'll keep an eye on for next year and see if that trend continues, and if all of us are flying more, or whether it's a bounce back from the pandemic because everyone got stuck in one place and felt the need to go abroad again. So that's an interesting trend that we've seen. And then the other line that I will come back to repeatedly in this presentation is the bright purple. Whenever you see a bright purple line from the CCC at the moment, it's surface transport, that means cars. And I think the flagship energy technology over the next decade is probably electric vehicles, close tied with heat pumps. But the electric vehicles data over the last year has been really astonishing. So we've had a really significant bounce in the sale of electric vehicles, and we think for the first time we're seeing electric vehicles starting to eat into surface transport emissions. So people are driving more, driving miles have gone up year on year, but because of the electric vehicle rollout in the fleet, we're actually starting to see emissions impacts, and that is, again, first time we're seeing that in the data, and really quite exciting. Bet you were really happy you came to a PowerPoint presentation instead of having a lunch. You're welcome. This is the story on coal, and I think if you're not an energy specialist, this is really accessible to people, and internationally this is something that the UK is now really famous for. We're the home of the Industrial Revolution, and we're the first developed economy in the world to get coal out of our electricity mix. I can remember when I was working at WWF and I led the coal phase-out campaign in the UK, and I can remember the absolute skepticism that we would ever get coal out of our mix and keep the lights on. And here we all are, and it went faster than we thought was possible, and it went faster because of the development of renewables, and primarily offshore wind. We turned off the last coal-fired station at Ratcliffe last October. And then this just breaks those emissions reductions down year on year by sector. And again, the story here is we've still got a lot to do in power. And power has been the real heavy lifter in terms of emissions reductions. Again, from last year, we've added a record amount of renewables onto the electricity system over the last year. And then you're starting to see, though, other areas of the economy start to use that electricity, particularly in transport. So we've seen maybe the first kind of change there, that 2% reduction down. The industry one, that's the impact of Port Talbot. So you can see that in our analysis. And when we did our advice to Wales, we said, you can't really do decarbonisation if you don't have a plan for industry. And it is in no one's interest if the way we decarbonise is to lose plants. So we're excited to see what happens with Port Talbot when they get their electric arc furnaces. Generally, the story of industry decarbonising has actually been a switch away from foundation industries and high-intensity industries towards high-value manufacturing, SMEs and smaller manufacturing. And we don't have the chart in this slide deck, but manufacturing GVA has actually risen as we've been decarbonising. So there's a kind of narrative that we must have achieved our emissions reduction to date through offshoring or importing more emissions. Actually, it's real tangible emissions reduction from decarbonising the power sector and also changing the nature of our industry. And we can see that in the data. This shows you, looking back and looking forward, where we expect emissions reduction to come from. There's a version of this in the 7th Carbon Budget Advice, which is more detailed. But all I really want you to take away from here is bright yellow, same colour for electricity generation, was doing a huge amount of the heavy lifting on where emissions reduction had to come from in the economy in the early carbon budgets. So this shows you the share of emissions reduction needed from each section of the economy. So if you look at bright yellow, this is electricity generation, hugely important over the last decade. Still important, job's not done. Let's see what the government do with their clean power mission. And they'll need to deliver on that, for sure. But really, really importantly, and the key message from the committee today is that this is now about other areas of the economy. And in the 7th Carbon Budget, we're saying something like a third of emissions come from household choices, but they're not the choices that everyone thinks, which are flying and diet. They are your choice to replace your boiler at the end of its life with an electric form of heating, and the choice to replace your car at the end of its life with an electric vehicle. That is 70% of the emissions that can be grouped at household level. And when we look at it across the economy, that's basically the bright purple block, which is road transport, where we need to see significant emissions reduction, and the bright orange block, which is residential buildings, where we need to see significant reduction. So at macroeconomic level, those are the sectors of the economy that need to change. At individual level, we need to start talking about those things, as well as the kind of climate movements. Very good history of talking to people about lifestyle more broadly. The infrastructure in your homes and the infrastructure of transport systems is where a lot of your emissions are coming from in your day-to-day life. As a side note, clearly we need to make those choices affordable to people, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Right. I said electric vehicles were my hero technology for the next at least 5 years, if not decade, in terms of decarbonising surface transport. And this shows you the trajectory that we're expecting. The bright purple bar at the end here is where we need electric vehicles to be, and the emission savings from the deployment of electric vehicles by 2030. I put this in here because what we get quite often back at the committee is people look at the bar charts on the right-hand side, which is the deployment of electric vehicles in the fleet, then they look at that big bar chart on the right and they're like, that's a very unrealistic curve. But I think a lot of you will be in business, this is what S-curve rollout looks like, and what exponential growth looks like in a kind of technology where you get cost parity. And we think there's very good data now to suggest that electric vehicles will be cheaper than the internal combustion engine before 2030. There are already some models at price parity, including made by European and UK manufacturers, but certainly in the global market. And once you hit price parity, you tend to get scale, and you tend to get rapid scale. So we've modelled all of our technology rollout curves on very predictable S-curves that have happened in other countries, and done the same for heat pumps. But we still need to do more, and this chart, which I won't go into too much detail, shows you where we've got to, what the ZEV mandate will do, so current government policy, which is the orange line, and the purple line is where we think it needs to go. So the good news is that the trajectory in black looks closer to what we think needs to happen than the ZEV mandate, but nevertheless, we do really need to see that pick up. And there was actually a pause in 2030 when there was uncertainty about the ZEV mandate, which does speak also to the fact that you all need clear communication from government, and sort of clear targets can help drive markets. Very similar story in heat pumps. This shows you the same picture, but for heat pumps, this is the rollout to date under various government schemes. There are less than 1% of homes with a heat pump now today. We need around 50% of homes to have a heat pump in 2040. That scale-up sounds massive, but again, we've modelled S-curves that are very familiar in established markets like Poland and what's happened there. And I will come on in a minute to what's key to making that happen. And again, similar stories with renewables generation. So rollout has happened, praise to government for getting their clean power mission in place, lots of good change happening, but still a pretty significant scale-up across offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar, all of which are feasible in what we can see in the pipelines. I just want to do this because of the nature of this particular event. Trees has been really successful over the last year, and we're very happy about it. Highest level of tree planting across the UK since the 1970s. Well done, everyone. People talk about tech solutions a lot. Trees are, apart from electric vehicles, the other silver bullet technology solution in a lot of our analysis, and we need to start planting trees today because they take 25 years to mature. So they're really, really important, and it's quite good news to see that spike. We're a bit nervous about whether or not that will continue because a lot of those trees are in Scotland where the government have just cut funding for tree planting. But it's still nevertheless a good story that it is possible to scale up in doing everything, including natural solutions. I will show you this. This is our scorecard for the government. And this is a very complicated slide that I'm not going to go all the way through. But the red and orange shows you where we're not sure that there's enough planning. And the green and yellow shows you where we're happier. The broad message from us today is there are more plans and more technology development that we are pleased about than there were a year ago. I think the next progress report will really be the time that we can properly assess this government's plans for delivery. To be fair to the previous administration, a lot of the delivery that we're seeing and that kind of change in technology rollout is based on policies like the ZEV mandate, the clean heat market mechanism, the boiler upgrade scheme, which are policies of the previous government finally kind of having an effect. The government's clean power plan is clearly having an effect, and they've been upgraded for it, but a lot of things, particularly around buildings, the warm homes plan and what they do with that, particularly around the changes they made to the ZEV mandate and whether that will kind of come through the market. These are all things that we probably won't see for another year. So where you see orange and red, it means there is a lot more to do, even if the overall news is better than last year. And I've just got a couple of slides to finish, and I promise, to pull a little bit at the public narrative on all of this. The first is the UK has done really well. We should be extremely proud of our progress. I am, and all of you at this conference. Climate leadership in the UK, because of the Climate Change Act, is a genuine achievement over the last decade. And we should defend it, but it is not true to say that we're out ahead of the pack. And this shows you the change in emissions across OECD and some non-OECD countries before and after the passing of net zero acts and before and after the Paris Agreement that kind of pulled the science of 1.5 degrees through. And what you see is the UK is amongst a pack of developed nations that have moved quickly, but we're not the only ones. We're alongside the United Kingdom, Japan, and the United Kingdom, the EU, ourselves. They were alongside the EU, Germany, France, Japan, and a lot of our major trading partners in having ambitious targets. And it's more important that we keep up with the pack than we fall behind. The other really interesting line on here is China, where emissions are still increasing, but after Paris really started to slow down, and China is now one of the biggest markets in the world for clean technology. So we're expecting emissions to peak in China over the next few years. Opinions differ as to exactly which year, but there are really positive stories across most major economies about decarbonisation. And very lastly, and this is my last message, we can't do all of this without something that I have hidden from you until now, which is most of our analysis and most of our optimism depends on making electricity cheaper. And that's because if you think about emissions reductions having to come from buildings and transport systems, from heating, from heat pumps and electric vehicles, these are electric technologies. We're putting low-cost renewables onto one end of the system, and we are asking people to adopt electric technologies in their homes. Quite clearly, we have to make those technologies cheaper for people. We have to make them cheaper for all homes. And the silver bullet for that, for the market in particular to be able to do it, is having an input fuel, electricity, that stacks up against the price of gas. In every other market where we've had a successful rollout of heat pumps, the electricity to gas price ratio has been 3-to-1. Ours in the UK is at least 4-to-1, and at times in the crisis was up at like 8-to-1, and that's because we are particularly dependent on gas in our wholesale markets. And this chart here shows you the relationship between electricity and gas in the wholesale markets. And all you need to take from this is if you can't see the difference between the two lines, that's because they map onto one another. So electricity tracks the gas price. Gas is expensive and it is volatile, and that makes it very difficult to build the industries of the future that depend on electricity. And so the very strong message from the Climate Change Committee today to say at the minimum we want to see the policy costs that sit on electricity moved. And then there are other things governments could do in terms of like market design to fix this particular problem in time too. And very lastly, if we do that, the savings that you get from using a cheap fuel in the economy are very real. So yes, we have to replace our infrastructure, but then we manifest savings for it in the economy. And this chart shows you our whole economy analysis for the carbon budget. The black line going up is where we have to invest in kit, mostly renewables, but also things like heat pumps over the next decade. Don't want to shy away from that. We do have to do the technology replacement. But after that one-off cost, you start to get the savings of cheaper, more efficient technologies in your economy. And from about 2040 onwards, the savings outpace the costs. And we only model up to 2050 because of the quirk of the Climate Change Act. But those savings actually roll forward because they are about using a more efficient fuel. So the idea that this is a project that is somehow bad for the economy, bad for industries, bad for growth, I would suggest that people aren't looking at the numbers. Fortunately, there is a body that does that. It's the Climate Change Committee. 400 pages of analysis online in the progress report today. Please go and read it. And I don't know if I now have time to take questions because I've talked through. I'm looking at Lucy. Can I do questions?
You could probably do a minute and a half of
right,
questions.
let's do two fast questions. And then, thank you.
I'm going to give you my microphone.
Does this work? Yes. I'm Agatha Kanson, and I work for London Councils. We represent the 33 local authorities in London. What is the role of local government in helping you achieve these emissions reductions?
So I think we've commissioned a bit of analysis looking specifically at the role of local government, which we will, I promise, publish soon. It's not finalised yet, but we have done some work. I think if you look at the 7th Carbon Budget Advice, we separate out public sector buildings, the role of kind of public procurement, and there's kind of clear things there. You're talking about transport systems. We've got things like modal shift in the analysis, so there are some very clear things which sit with local government, which you can find. And there will be a specific report coming on local governments. And to declare an interest, I'm on the board of UK 100, so also there is that thing about climate literacy, communicating with the public and sort of training staff, which I think is a really important role for local government too. And I'm being told that was my only question. You can come and find me. I'll be around. Thank you.
Sorry to the other people that wanted to ask a question.